Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum call?
We're not.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, families and businesses across the country are worried about the safety and stability of our banking system. 2 weeks ago, Silicon Valley Bank, a bank that many people had never heard of, rocketed from relative obscurity to infamy when it suddenly and unexpectedly collapsed. The bank, which reported $212 billion in assets last quarter, is now known as the biggest bank failure since the 2008 financial crisis. It's the second largest bank failure in American history. Well, the American people quickly learned that Silicon Valley Bank had made some pretty risky investment decisions. When interest rates were low, it purchased long-term Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. As the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to fight record inflation, the value of those investments tumbled. SVB attempted to stop the bleeding by selling $21 billion worth of assets at a loss of nearly $2 billion. Well, it didn't take long for this entire house of cards to come tumbling down. When customers learned about its financial troubles, it caused a run on deposits. And of course, no bank can withstand a run on its deposits where people demand to get paid back immediately when many of the investments that were made are longer-term investments. Shortly after the Silicon Valley Bank implosion, Signature Bank, a regional bank in New York, collapsed as well. And now, major banks have pledged to help rescue First Republic Bank from potentially succumbing to the same fate. My assumption is this isn't done out of the goodness of their heart, but they realize that if this contagion continues to spread across the country, it could imperil our entire economy. Given the potential implications of this situation, the administration and federal regulators quickly jumped into damage control mode. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, otherwise known as FDIC, quickly announced that depositors at Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank would have full access to their funds, even above the uninsured deposits, even above the insured deposits. Of course, under existing law, FDIC insures deposits only up to $250,000, but FDIC quickly announced that that cap on insurance would be lifted. President Biden also attempted to assure the American people that the banking system was safe. Secretary Yellen did the same. In a speech yesterday, she said the U.S. banking system remains sound. But the truth of the matter is it's impossible to make guarantees when you're dealing with something as uncertain as human behavior. And the wildfire-like spread of information across social media and elsewhere where people can, with a click of their phone, withdraw all their deposits from an institution. So while these are hopeful statements by the President and Secretary Yellen, it doesn't guarantee anything. The health of the banking system doesn't just depend on objective measures of financial health, but also on public perception and public confidence. Even a bank with a rock-solid financial ground wouldn't be able to withstand a run on deposits. That's not how the banking system is designed to operate. They have to keep a certain amount of reserves so they can respond quickly to a demand for deposits, but no bank is prepared to pay all depositors 100% of what they have deposited on demand. Fears of contagion are very real in the banking industry, which is why everyone's eager to understand what went wrong. When it comes to Silicon Valley Bank, which, as one of my constituents described it, he said, "Oh, that's Mark Zuckerberg's bank." Of course, it was guaranteed deposits above the insured amount. We need to make sure there's not cherry picking when it comes to the policies that apply here. lest people think there's a double standard. For example, if you were a bank in Midland, Texas, lending primarily to the oil and gas industry, do you think the FDIC and the Biden administration would step up and guarantee those deposits above the $250,000 mark? Well, that's an unanswered question, but there shouldn't be a double standard. But the first problem, well, the problem really is it looks like there were multiple points of failure at Silicon Valley Bank. First is with the bank's management. Making these long-term investments in the face of rising interest rates because of the Federal Reserve's efforts to combat inflation, it's clear they failed to adjust their investment strategy to take into account the depreciation of the value of those longer-term bonds. They either didn't recognize the impact that rates had on its assets, or they simply were negligent or willfully ignored the reality. I'm not sure what it was, but none of it was good. Given the fact that the bank was without a chief risk officer for more than a year, it seems clear that risk management was not Silicon Valley Bank's top priority. In addition to the bank's failures, there were also major regulatory failures. Reports indicate that the Federal Reserve raised concerns about Silicon Valley Bank's risk management multiple times over the past few years. The first red flag was raised in January of 2019, more than 4 years ago. Once that happens, the Fed's supposed to monitor the bank and ensure these problems are being addressed. We simply don't have information to confirm whether or not that happened, but based on where things stand now, it seems like it did not happen. While SVB executives and regulators carry some of the blame for the current banking system chaos, we cannot ignore the role played by the administration and by some of the policies that have been promoted by our colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle. As our country battled the pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis, our Democratic colleagues alone, without any Republican votes, appropriated about $2.6 trillion more, using the budget resolution that did not require any Republican votes. It wasn't a bipartisan effort. This was strictly a spending spree by our Democratic colleagues under the benign heading of American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act. $2.6 trillion. That was like gasoline on the inflation fire. Republicans warned our colleagues that this kind of spending would lead to more problems than solutions. There were a lot of warnings about what impact this kind of spending would have after dealing with the COVID crisis, what the impact would be on the economy, particularly with constrained supply chains and a smaller workforce. Putting that kind of financial stimulus into our economy was guaranteed to fan the flames of inflation. Well, as I said, the first round was a $1.9 trillion so-called American Rescue Plan, which our colleagues tried to brand as pandemic relief. But as the American people learned, less than 10% of that legislation was even remotely related to the pandemic. And the rest was exactly the type of things you'd expect to see in a bill that was supported only by our Democratic colleagues. Everything from funding for climate justice to backdoor money for Planned Parenthood. Leading economists warned at the time that this was not a recipe for economic recovery. Even Larry Summers cautioned that this package could, and I quote, set off inflationary pressures of a kind we have not seen in a generation, close quote. Still, our colleagues couldn't be convinced to change course, show a little self-restraint, a little bit of prudence, a little bit of caution. They abused the rules of the Senate to pass a partisan spending bill that, again, only depended on Democratic votes. And lo and behold, this is where we landed. Our country has experienced inflation at a level we've not seen in 40 years. Prices have skyrocketed for gas, groceries, housing, and just about everything else. For some reason, our colleagues did not connect the dots between this reckless spending spree and the growing strain on our economy, or its impact on the price of groceries, or the price at the pump you pay for gasoline or diesel. So rather than tap the brakes, they opted to put the pedal to the metal. Well, the second bill was the even more absurdly named Inflation Reduction Act, which all the outside studies showed would not reduce inflation anytime in the near term. Our colleagues wanted the American people to forget the fact that unchecked spending would help usher in this terrible inflationary pressure, and somehow, counterintuitively, they seem to think that even more spending would solve the problem. Our colleagues' solution to inflation included handouts for wealthy people buying electric vehicles. Why in the world would you pay rich people to buy an electric vehicle when most working families couldn't afford one? You're handing out tax subsidies to rich people. And then there was the $80 billion supersizing of the IRS, so it can squeeze every penny possible from working middle-class families and small businesses. You know, this to me is just malpractice. We had the new IRS commissioner in front of the Finance Committee, and we said, you know, when can we expect your plan on how to spend the $80 billion and this plan to hire 87,000 new IRS agents? And he said, oh, it's coming. But our Democratic friends got it backward. Instead of saying, here's the plan and how much does it cost to implement the plan, they said, here's the money, you come up with a plan. Only in Washington, D.C. does the world operate that way. But between those two bills, our colleagues spent roughly $2.6 trillion on a partisan spending spree, just as some economists, including Democratic economists like Larry Summers, just like they predicted these bills did nothing to reduce inflation, they made it worse. Of course, we know that the Federal Reserve has the responsibility to try to address inflation. And one of their few tools is to raise interest rates, to slow the economy down, to increase unemployment in order to bring that inflation down. Higher borrowing costs slow down the economy and curb demand, but it requires the United States to pay our bondholders who purchase our debt even more money for the debt we incur, now roughly around $1 trillion in interest on a $31 trillion national debt. So over the last year, in order to combat inflation, the Federal Reserve has hiked interest rates 9 times. 9 times. We've witnessed the fastest series of rate increases since the early 1980s, but it still hasn't been enough to cool the red-hot inflation contributed to by our colleagues' reckless spending. While I appreciate the administration's effort to stop the contagion from spreading, I'd like to see our colleagues acknowledge the circumstances that led us here. Despite warnings of trillions of dollars in spending would lead to record inflation, our colleagues seem to just run through that red light anyway. As a result, this is something that, to be blunt, they own. It's driven up the cost of everything from basic expenses like groceries and electricity. And then, of course, there are the subsequent interest rate hikes, which has made it more expensive to buy a house or borrow money to buy a car, for example, or to finance your small business. That's a direct result of the inflationary pressures caused by excessive Washington spending, again, like pouring gasoline on the fire. And now we know this same inflation has contributed to the failure of banks like Silicon Valley Bank. Admittedly, due in part to the mismanagement by the bank and the lack of appropriate supervision by regulators, but the reason why Silicon Valley Bank got in trouble in the first place is because the value of their treasury bonds, where they had invested some of their reserves, kept going down because it's inversely proportional to interest rates. Democrats kicked off an economic crisis, and now everybody is paying the price. I'd like to know, as they look back on it now, whether they think it was worth it. Mr. President, I yield the floor.